I regard myself, as I've said over and over in these lectures, as a fairly lumpen person, rational, requiring drugs to access these dimensions, not lightly poised on the edge of the other. Nevertheless, coming out of the experiences that are described in True Hallucinations, there were years, and in fact, to some degree it persists to this day, years of having a connection with a kind of organizing intelligence that seemed very different in its style of thinking from my own style of thinking. And the nature of the dialogue with this entity, it wasn't about world peace and loving one another or one woman, one child, or any of these grandiose things that we've talked about here. It was more in the nature of a koan, like a problem that I was supposed to solve, that if I could solve, then there would somehow be great benefit for me intellectually behind this. But it was clearly something that I had originally encountered in the psychedelic state and that stuck with me. And, you know, if you want to understand how I got to that place, True Hallucinations tells that story to some degree. This dialogue with the mushroom mother took the form of a kind of very deep deconstruction of what the I Ching is about, because apparently time is the key both to understanding the psychedelic experience and to understanding the mystery of our own life and existence, both generally and particularly. Time is the thing that we need to concentrate on and understand. And of course, if you look at the literature of human philosophy, you discover that the oldest book in the world is a book that is a study of time, the Book of Changes, the I Ching, the distillation of pre-Joe philosophical ruminations that go back to the late Neolithic. Nobody knows how old. And now I'm going to talk about this in some detail. I assume most people in this room have some kind of familiarity with the I Ching, right? Am I right? So just briefly to review, for those of you who lack the courage to admit ignorance. The I Ching is a system of Chinese divination that uses 64 six-line structures called hexagrams. And these hexagrams are thought to be gestalt images of the way in which power is distributed within a given situation that the person inquiring of the oracle has defined ahead of time. And these 64 hexagrams, as they're called, define the complete set of possible structures given the rules that you have 6 levels and broken and unbroken lines. Then there are 64 variants on that set of constraints. And these are called hexagrams. We all know this, am I right? Yes. Okay. The hexagrams occur in a traditional order that is called the King Wen sequence. And King Wen is a quasi-legendary person, pre-Han dynasty, a political figure who, in the upheavals in ancient Neolithic China, was imprisoned. And during his imprisonment, he supposedly elaborated these 64 hexagrams in this traditional sequence. Whether he was a real person, we'll probably never know. What the mushroom voice concentrated on was a very specific and intellectually defined question at first. And the question was this: is the King Wen sequence a sequence? In other words, is it simply a jumble a jumbled arrangement of hexagrams that has become traditional over thousands of years? Or is it a true sequence, meaning can it be generated by rules? And if so, what are those rules? Well, if you had known me over a lifetime, you would know that this is not my style of thinking. I mean, I failed Algebra 2. After the stabbing, I transferred out. So, mathematics, that's a joke, folks. After quadratic equations, I bailed. So close thinking is not my forte. So here was this question, is the King-Wen sequence a sequence or is it a chaotic jumble? What are the rules which generate it? So I sat down with my I Ching and flipped it open. It wasn't, as I say, my style. Immediately, meaning in 10 minutes, I grasped that the King-Wen sequence is not 64 hexagrams, it's 32 pairs of hexagrams, because the second member of each pair is the first turned upside down. Claro? Good. Nothing to it. So, the nature of the problem has now changed. The question now is, what is the ordering principle which governs these 32 pairs of hexagrams? And this did not come so easily. I looked, and finally the voice said to me, look at the first order of difference. And I said, what is the first order of difference? And it said, the number of lines that change as you move from one hexagram to the next. Stupid. So I said, okay, we'll look at the first order of difference. So now, as you probably know, the first hexagram is the creative, 6 solid lines. The second hexagram is the receptive, 6 broken lines. What is the first order of difference? 6, right. Oh, I didn't say that the first rule is that they occur in pairs where the second member of the pair is the first inverted. But if inverting the first one causes no change, as would occur in 8 cases, then all lines change. That's very logical and intuitive and clear, I think. And you meet that first exception in the first pair. The first hexagram is 6 unbroken lines. Obviously, inverting it makes no difference. So you invoke the second rule. If inversion makes no difference, all lines change. Right? Okay. So I looked at the first order of difference. Now, the first order of difference, logically, can be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. When you actually look at what it is in the King-Wen sequence, the first thing you notice is that there are no 5s. This is an artificiality. This is the thumbprint of human intent. Because when you program a computer to arrange these hexagrams randomly and to chart the first order difference, first order difference values of 5 are very common. There is nothing in principle to exclude them, but for some reason they were excluded from the King-Wen sequence. The other thing I noticed was that the ratio of odd to even values of the first order of difference came out to be exactly 3 to 1, 3 even to 1 odd. This again is the thumbprint of human intent. Randomly arranged sequences don't have this property. So I didn't know what this meant. It just seemed like, yes, maybe we were becoming sinologists and exploring the construction principles in a forgotten Chinese oracle. But then it suggested to me that I make a graph of the first order of difference. So I made a graph, 64 points down, 6 points across, graph the first order of difference, 6, 2, 4, 3, 1, 6, 1, 3, etc. When I made this graph and looked at it, it appeared rather stochastic, meaning it appeared random. No pattern of order jumped out, until I noticed something very interesting, which was that the first 3 data points were a mirror image of the last 3 data points. Now what this means is if we were to take a copy of this wave and rotate it 180 degrees in the plane, which is how mathematicians say turn it upside down. If we were to rotate it 180 degrees in the plane, it would slide into itself with a perfect fit at the beginning and at the end, but nowhere in between. This is highly improbable. This is definitely someone sat up nights trying to make this happen, and there were many trials and errors before they got it. So I thought, well, how strange. Then here we have, what we now have is a structure, 64 hexagrams running this way, and 64 hexagrams running backward, and they arrange themselves in pairs such that they add to 64. 63 and 1, 62 and 2, 61 and 3, 60 and 4. Do you understand? Yes. So I thought, what a strange thing, a module. We've taken the entire sequence of the I Ching, run it backwards against itself, and discovered that it creates a natural topological closure. It's a natural module. A natural module. What an onomatopoetic phrase. So then, it's sort of like a super hexagram. It has all the hexagrams in it running both ways. It has 384 yao in it. Yao are lines. 6 times 64 equals 384. And then the teaching voice said, take this module and use it as the lowest level of a larger module hierarchy based on the I Ching. In other words, take this module and treat it as a line in a hexagram. So, okay. So I drew this little structure with its closure, and then I made 6 copies of it, and I laid them end to end on my bedroom floor. What my friends were thinking about me during this period is another story, but I'm just giving you the raw shtick here. So I laid 6 of these structures end to end and said, aha, these are like the 6 lines of a hexagram. And then the voice said yes, but a hexagram is more than 6 lines. A hexagram is 2 trigrams. The learning curve here is steep, but bear with me. So I took my little structure, my little module, and I blew it up by a power of 3. And over the 6, I laid 2 more, generated from the same origin point, but proportionately 3 times larger. Do you understand? Yes. So then I looked at this, and then the voice said, but a hexagram is more than 6 lines and more than 2 trigrams. A hexagram has a unitary wholeness that is hexagrammatic. I said, okay. So I made a great big version of my little module, and over the 6 and over the 2, I laid this higher level, the big 1. So now what I have is a 3-level structure with 1 module on the top, 2 modules in the middle, and 6 modules on the bottom. And I drew this thing with a rapidograph, believe it or not, in the confines of my smoky room. What you get if you do this is a shitload of wavy lines running in all directions and crossing over each other. And I had no idea what this thing was for. And the voice assured me that this was somehow a Gestalt symbol of time. And so I began meditating and thinking about this and looking at the numerology of this structure. Well, remember that I mentioned that it had 384 yao, 384 lines, which are the 6 times 64 number. This is an interesting number, 384, because it turns out to be within a fraction of a day, 13 lunations. Lunations are 29 point something days, and 13 of them are 383.89 days. So I said, 13 lunations. This thing is a calendar of some sort. It's a lunar calendar. It must have been developed somewhere in southern China where seasonality wasn't so important, because it would precess 19 days against the solar year length of 365 days. But it would keep perfect lunar time, you know, with an error that would accumulate to about 1 day every 100 years or something. Very good for a Neolithic calendar. But then the voice said, yes, but there's more. I said, okay, well, so then I sat with it, and it said, take the number 384 days and multiply it by other numbers that are natural to the I Ching. So I took 384 days and I multiplied it times 64. And I discovered that this is 67 years, 104.25 days. And I noticed that that is 6 sunspot cycles of 11 years, assigning 1 sunspot cycle to each line of a hexagram. I also, in then researching sunspot cycles, I discovered that there is not only an 11-year sunspot cycle, there is also a 33-year major sunspot cycle, which would naturally fall to each trigram. And I then learned that the ancient Chinese were the first people in the world to observe sunspots. They were observing sunspots through smoked pieces of obsidian AD 1500, BC 1500. Interesting. So then I went further. I took the number 67 years, 104.25 days, and I multiplied it by 64. And I got 4,306 years, a period of time that effectively assigns 1 trigram to each zodiacal age of 2,200 years. And again, I learned that the ancient Chinese were the first people to notice the precession of the equinox, which is a very large 26,000-year cycle that repeats itself. So I thought, you know, this is very far out. Now notice that all of these phenomena that are being coordinated by this set of resonant numbers are naked eye phenomena. Lunations, sunspots, and the precession of the equinox. This can all be observed with the naked eye. We're not hypothesizing some advanced technology. We're just hypothesizing advanced conscious thinking about mathematical problems. So this is obscure. I thought maybe I could publish an article in Sky and Telescope or Archaeology or something, I Ching linked to ancient Neolithic resonance calendar. Not the sort of thing that would move you to the edge of your chair in most cases. But I had the very strong conviction when I looked at this wavy structure, this three-level structure that I described to you, the very strong conviction that somehow this was very important, that it was, that I had not gone far enough, and that this was somehow a picture of time. And I began to think about time, and I began to try and understand it the way the ancient Chinese understood it, the way the people who created and inherited the I Ching understood it. And I came by, reading a lot of Chinese philosophy in translation to see that the Chinese have a completely different view of time from the Western thing. And I want to now make a little caesura here and background you in this. The scientific view of time is what is called pure duration. It was defined by Newton. Essentially, time is simply what you have in order that things can happen. It's a featureless, abstract, mathematical dimension. It's not a thing in the world. It's an idea. It's an idea. And that notion of time, that it is featureless and perfectly smooth, probabilistically, persisted up until 1905, when there was minor adjustments made in it by Einstein, who added the caveat that in the presence of massive gravitational bodies, the perfectly smooth surface is given a very, very slight curvature. Now, this idea of time is central and indispensable to science, because Western science is built on the implications of the concept of experiment and the deduction of data out of experimental procedure depends fundamentally on the assumption/belief that the time when the experiment is performed is irrelevant. Do you understand what I mean? So that when somebody says the speed of light is X, they cannot add on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but on Monday through, In other words, experimental data is assumed to be time dependent. And the underlying philosophical assumption there, then, is that time is this perfectly smooth, featureless surface which can always be given a zero value with confidence. That's how science does its work. All right. The Chinese idea, it could hardly be more different. The Chinese idea is closer to our notion of how matter works. The scientific idea about matter developed in the West is that matter is made up of elements, and these elements at a certain level of energy are irreducible. They cannot be changed into each other. We now know that in the nuclear level they can be changed into each other. But at the level of ordinary chemical process, elements are fundamental. And there are 106 or 7 or 8 of them. And all material phenomena are built up out of these 108 elements. The Chinese notion of time is very similar to this. It's the idea not that time is a philosophical abstraction, but that time is a very diffuse but real medium, somewhat the way we conceive of an electromagnetic field, and that time is composed of elements, and that these elements are irreducible, and that there is a finite number of them, not 108, as we believe about the elements of matter, but guess what? 64. 64 temporal elements. Think of them as 64 species of happenstance. And the Chinese idea is that the world of ongoing becoming, the phenomenal world undergoing the formality of occurring, is an interference pattern created by the interplay and intermeshing and intermingling of these temporal elements, these temporal species. So that then the theory of the I Ching is it's sort of like sticking a dipstick into an engine to see the level of the oil. You throw the I Ching, and the universal temporal flux that is flowing by at many speeds on many levels, you like perform a measurement on it. You take an average, as it were, and you discover, hexagram 49 changing to 13 or whatever it is. It's a gestalt readout of the immediate situation in the temporal flux. Do you see? So, and it's a completely different idea from the idea about time in the West, because what it says is that time is as important as space, that you never have the same set of conditions twice. The perfectly smooth Aristotelian surface of time established by Newton is seen to be a fiction. And now notice that Western science began with Aristotelian objects, perfect circles, perfect cubes, and the Copernican revolution in astronomy was essentially the getting rid of perfect circles in the Ptolemaic system. One by one, the perfect philosophical objects of Greek mathematics had to be discarded. The only one we've hung on to up until the present moment is this myth of the perfectly smooth surface of time in contraposition to this Chinese position. Now, think about your own experience. What we experience is much more like what the Chinese say time is like. We experience surges of connection and coincidence, and then dry spells. We experience waves of synchronicity, and everything seems to go right, then everything seems to go wrong. We don't seem to be living on a perfectly flat probabilistic plane. We seem to be living in a kind of heaving ocean of synchronicity and probability and uncertainty and so forth and so on. Okay, close paragraph. Back to the rat. This three-leveled thing that I had created, I had the very strong intuition that it was describing this ebb and flow that I'm talking about. And I could have used Taoist terminology. I could have called it the Tao wave or something like that. But I wanted to anchor it in a metaphysic that I knew was mathematically secure. So I adopted the vocabulary of Alfred North Whitehead, who I think is one of the great neglected geniuses of the 20th century. I mean, I think you can throw away your Sanskrit dictionaries, folks. It was all done in good Oxfordian English by Whitehead. And in a book called Process and Reality, which is his masterpiece, he develops at great length the concept of novelty and the idea that the universe is an ebb and flow of novelty, that the way to think of reality is as a kind of dynamic tension between two forces which I've adapted from Whitehead, and then following a suggestion of Rupert Sheldrake's, I've called these two forces habit and novelty. And habit and novelty are locked in eternal dynamic tension. Every time there's a surge of novelty, it's eventually quenched and halted by a reversion to habit. Every time there is an accumulation of constipated habit, tradition, repetition, entropy, it's eventually perturbed by an outbreak of novelty. And this happens on every time scale. It happens on a scale of billions of years. It happens on a scale of microseconds. Habit, novelty, novelty. But, and here's the good news, it is in fact not an eternal struggle, because over eons of time, novelty is winning. Novelty is winning. It is slowly accumulating. Novelty builds upon previously established foundations of novelty. Now, previously in the weekend, I used the word complexity because I hadn't explained this term. But can you see how it works? It's that upon the atoms, which are novel when they first appear, come the molecules, a new form of novelty. Upon the rules of molecular construction can be built long-chain polymers, a deeper emergence into novelty. Upon those long-chain polymers can be built self-replicating molecules like DNA that are the basis for life, deeper descent into novelty. Upon DNA can be built complex membranes, multicellular animals, life as we know it, deeper advance into novelty, and upon the platform of organic life rises the platform of higher mammalian organization, and upon the platform of higher mammalian organization arises the platform of self-reflecting primate consciousness, and upon that platform is built an electronic, globe-girdling civilization that can hurl instruments outside the solar system and measure the temperatures of distant stars. Novelty is winning. Now, one more thing to notice about this. Each stage of advance into novelty happens faster than the stage which preceded it. This is not a curve like this into novelty, or like this, steeply descending into novelty. It's a curve like this. It's a spiral, where each turn of the spiral happens at a rate of collapse 1/64 that of the length of the previous spiral. And these were the things which were whispered to me by this disembodied voice during this period of time when my friends were holding meetings about whether it should be the tranquilizing dart or physical overwhelmment.
Terence, how does it become at 64th as fast each time? I mean, is that speculation? I mean,
well, I'll show you when I get to it on the computer here. Yeah.
Novelty then be like evolutionary change.
Yes.
And then what you say the circles are, that would be like circle on top of circle, level on top of level, growing and growing.
Think of it as an involuting spiral that's going faster and faster toward an omega point. Okay. Now, if you haven't understood anything so far, it's all right, because, as you'll see. So I had all these convictions about time and all these ideas, and I was just abuzz with it. I mean, I was frightening to people. I could hold people prisoner for 16 hours at a stretch. I didn't sleep often. I would hold forth. I mean, I was not publicly presentable. It's taken this long to get it dialed down into a user-friendly piece of entertainment rather than a burning-eyed hysterical rave. But so I had this occult diagram this three-level wavy system of lines, and I would carry it around like a scroll and show it to people. It was about 8 feet long, and say, you know, this is a map of time. This is a map of hyperspace. This is an intellectual achievement on the scale of the wheel or something, and it's been passed down. You know, I was on Mount Sinai, and here's what the burning bush said. And most people just turned away aghast. But my friend Ralph Abraham said to me, he said, you know, this thing is just an occult diagram. Only you can interpret it. It means nothing to anybody else. What you have to do is you have to turn it into an ordinary mathematical object of some sort. He said all objects, all topologies can be transformed into other topologies. You must take this thing and turn it into a normal mathematical object of some sort. Well, essentially, this was like telling a turtle to fly. I mean, I'm not a mathematician. Remember the stabbing. So I just thought, you know, well, this is a kind of a death sentence on this rap, because orthodox research mathematicians lock their doors when they know I'm coming. And I don't have the head to do this. I do not even know where to begin on such a task. And so I sat with it for like 3 years. And then one afternoon in Berkeley, I was getting loaded, and as I usually do. And I saw how it could be done. Just within 30 seconds, I saw how this complex occult mathematical thing could be turned into an ordinary fractal wave that could be displayed on a Cartesian graph and time scaled. And I made notes and went through it, and yes, it could be done. It could be done. And all my so-called occult intuitions about the wave were preserved in the new mathematical object that I had created, that perfectly preserved everything about the other wave. I hesitated because I think that I created is a misnomer. I mean, this stuff was just downloaded as fast as I could listen to it, and I felt no responsibility for it at all. I mean, I was just sitting there going, I see, yes, right, like that. We created the first simulations, time-scaled simulations of the wave on CDC 6400 at Cal in Fortran on punch cards in 1975, and then in 77, small computers came along, and we've been modeling and working with this thing ever since. Now, if you didn't understand any of that, it's okay, the next part is still fun. All you need to know is that through some kind of mumbo-jumbo having to do with the I Ching, I claim to have a wave which describes history. That's it. Because here's the thing. This theory, unlike any theory to emerge out of the occult or the New Age in this century, this theory can be tested and overthrown by ordinary means. In other words, this theory wants to play with the big boys. This is a mathematically anchored theory that makes a fundamental attack on scientific ontology in its own terms. And the test is history. No one has ever been able to model history predictively. No one has ever been able to predict the future accurately. And I maintain that within the terms that I will establish in the rest of the lecture, we have succeeded. And this proves my contention that what psychedelics are tools for entry into a higher mathematical superspace. They are not intrinsically about the human psyche. They are about something much more fundamental to the structure of the universe. They're about the way space and time and casuistry are put together. And what we see when we take high doses of psychedelics is we see a higher dimensional modality in the mathematical sense, not in the metaphorical sense, but we actually are somehow liberated from the incoming sensorium of three-dimensional space and liberated into a higher dimension.